You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and Friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Christopher Zehnder. Today we turn to the vexed and vexing topics of nationalism, statism, and sovereignty in light of the common good. Joining us is once more Professor Randall Smith of the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Let's begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Let's begin by talking about virtue and vice and where nationalism fits. Professor Smith, what are we to say about nationalism? It's surging nationalism. Well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? What's going on?
Well, if somebody were to ask me, is nationalism a virtue or a vice, I suppose I would say neither, right? I mean, nationalism, and part of the, I've written some articles on this, as you know, and part of the issue is it depends on what you mean by nationalism and obviously what you're devoting yourself to and how you're devoting yourself to it. It seems to me that what you'd have to say, right, is that for nationalism to be of something like a virtue or virtuous, you know, using the adjective, you'd have to say that somehow the nation state, right, the nation and its political elements, et cetera, were devoted to the common good, right? And then the people involved would have to consider seriously what kind of virtues would be needed to achieve that common good, right? And if they developed sufficiently the kinds of virtues needed to preserve the common good, then you would say that it's a virtue, right? If they had no sense of common good, if they had only a sense of power, wealth, status, you know, et cetera, then I suppose you'd say, well, now what you have is something which is generating vices, right? And it seems to me similarly that if you had a populace that was full of nothing but vices, you could never have a nationalism which was going to be virtuous.
Suppose someone says it's time we put America first, and then said, I now entertain questions from the audience. What would your question be?
Well, one might say something similar to what Jacques Maritain said when he wrote about these things. And in my articles, I really just use some distinctions from Jacques Maritain. But you might say, first before what, right? I mean, in other words, America first before the principles of the Decalogue, America first before God, America first before the national law. Now, look, I'm not suggesting people say America first mean that, but it's, of course, whenever we use these easygoing phrases, sometimes we have to step back and think about, well, what do I mean when I say that, right? And so, again, you simply say, as, again, Jacques Maritain did when he was talking about this issue of sovereignty, well, sovereign in its original meaning meant something like this, something like, okay, primary in such a way that it can't be judged by any higher authority. And if you want to say somehow America first, like America's sovereign, and you mean, therefore, we can't be judged by, higher standards of justice, natural law, divine authority, well, then you have to say, well, no, I'm sorry, I can't say America first that way, right? So, in other words, if you mean America first, like America right or wrong, right? Well, then I think you're going down a very dangerous path, right? You mean America first, like I will devote myself to it, lives, fortunes, sacred honor. Sure, but if you mean we do what we do and no one can tell us not to do what we do, and that's what freedom is, well, that wouldn't be, seems to me a legitimate notion of America first, right?
Yes. Now, Mario, what would you add at this point?
Well, good morning, Professor Smith. When I hear that America first come to my mind, whether we are talking about America as a nation, or American government, which one is it? So, as you suggested, Maritain distinguished clearly between nation and the state. So, do we need to make a distinction in order to answer that problem, if you will, about America first?
Yeah, it does seem to me we use this term, as you've said quite rightly, right? Or let me say quite rightly that Maritain makes a distinction for nation state. We use this term nation state, right? So you hear this. Of course, that's the just sort of shoves together two terms which maybe we ought to distinguish. And what the nation, according to Maritain, and let me just quote him a little bit. Where it says the word nation originates from the Latin nasci, that is from the notion of birth. But the nation is not something biological like the race. It is something ethico-social, a human community based on the fact of birth and lineage, yet with all the moral connotations of those terms. Birth to the life of reason, the activities of civilization, lineage and familial traditions, social and juridical formation, cultural heritage, common conceptions and manners, historical recollections, sufferings, claims, hopes, prejudices, and resentments. So in other words, you're talking about, a cultural, ethical, political thing, right? Right. We in the United States have a political set of political traditions. We don't have a parliament like they have in England, but here's the point. In England, they have a parliament. This would, of course, would have come very naturally, it seems to me, to a Frenchman, right? Because you talk about the French nation. It also, it seems to me, would have come very naturally and did to somebody like John Paul II. There's this famous phrase in Poland. We know, people who write about John Paul II, people in Poland will say, John Paul II saved the nation from the state, right? Meaning he saved the Polish culture, people, traditions, religion, et cetera, from the Soviet-imposed communist state that dominated for, decades, all right? And so we might say, okay, the state, as Maritain understands it, is that part of the body politic that's especially concerned with maintenance of law, promotion of the common welfare and public order, administration of public affairs, right? It's that part of the body politic that specializes in the interests of the whole, right? And it's supposed to have the kind of broad perspective needed to direct the affairs of the different members, the different parts of the body politic to the common good. That, at least, one might say is Maritain's, I don't want to say ideal notion, like it's not something that could ever happen. I just mean it's like that's what ought to happen. It's not what he's very aware that's not what always happens by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, so it's important to distinguish those two, the nation from the state. And what you put is just one more thing, is to say, yeah, the nation versus the government, right? But again, we don't necessarily want to disassociate ourselves from the government in the sense that we have no responsibility for it, particularly in the United States. But we just want to say, yeah, we understand that, governmental entities, people who control the governments, will sort of come and go, and the nation remains, right?
Now, truth be told, Christopher Zehnder does not always agree with Jacques Maritain, and he might want to even contest some of these distinctions. At any rate, Christopher, what do you have to say at this point so far?
Well, I think there's, to really understand the terms, there is a distinction, obviously, between the government and what we might call the nation. I mean, for instance, Germany has existed under various different constitutions. You think of the constitution that was established in 1870, and then you have the Weimar Republic, and you have the Nazi regime, and now we have the modern regime in Germany. But we refer to that Germany as being one nation. I guess, though, the whole question of what a nation is seems very unclear to me. For instance, before the German Empire of 1870, Austria was actually considered part of Germany. Now it's considered, I would imagine, a separate nation from Germany, even though it shares a very similar culture to the rest of the German regions. It speaks a language. They all speak a kind of Hochdeutsch now, but even the dialect is somewhat similar to the rest of them. However, it differs. It has historically different in religion. It's there are different. There are distinct customs, and this is true throughout Germany. What is the central thing? I mean, is there one thing that unites a people into a nation? Like, for instance, the United States. I've lived in California. I now live in Ohio. I've lived in New England and in Virginia. And I could say that there are a lot of differences, very significant differences between these regions on a cultural level. In what sense are we one nation? What makes us one nation? What does make a nation a nation?
Well, that could, Christopher, that could depend, right, it seems to me. I mean, Maritain's doing a sort of, very philosophical sort of analysis, but it leaves open the possibility that there could be a number of different ways of understanding that. But let me get back for a second, because it's important to understand, because you've mentioned the historical sort of, I don't know whether it's obvious, but the development of the notion of the nation state, and the development of this kind of nation state idea, as everyone on this panel knows, comes about late 16th, 17th century, right?
Right.
And then eventually what we get is this kind of unifying ideal of classical, the classical idea, and you get Napoleon, and you get, okay, we're all going to unify under these certain sort of Enlightenment ideals. And then out of that, right, in the early 19th century, for example, you get this idea of, no, you're making everybody, I mean, we'll see whether the European Union goes through this, you're making everybody the same, right? We don't all want to do this sort of thing that they do in Paris or Austria, whatever, we want to have music, for example, this is very famous, right, that comes out of, the ethnic, okay, and local sort of regional characteristics. And so you have the Hungarian dances. I mean, you have Russian, you have things that start to not be Mozart, but start to have a very, very distinctive local flair, right, and that come out of the folk culture of the area, okay? And so then you're sort of like, oh, well, nations, right, particularly after World War I, where there had been empires, nations, right, like ethnic groups, people who are united by language and culture and art, et cetera, they should have their own state, right? And that was the idea after World War I, like, oh, here's an enclave of people. Well, why did you draw the borders there? And the answer was, well, because they were a nation. And so as a nation, then they wanted their own state, all right? And, so we might say there's a certain legitimacy to that, But we also have to challenge, it seems to me, a certain parochialism that can develop in those areas. And then we have this issue of traditions that, instead of being living traditions, become dead traditions, right? I mean, so, you can have Jewish culture, you can have Amish culture, whatever, which can start to sort of die because it's not developing organically, but it needs to develop. So anyway, the point is that what makes a nation, in one sense, it might be a shared language. In one sense, it might be a shared artistic tradition, right? We all listen to Mozart or something, but in other cases, it just might be a shared political tradition. I think one thing, Christopher, in answer to your question is, I would think in one way, one of the things that has always made the United States a nation is a shared memory of a struggle for independence and a shared devotion to a constitutional order. That's the one thing that Americans, I think, have been and are rightly proud of, is that they have a constitution which is superb in many, many ways, right? Which we're losing our sense of, and this is why we're no longer a nation, because people don't respect the constitutional order or understand the constitutional order. Anyway, so that's what I would just say about that.
May I interject in something?
Please, yes, go ahead, Mario.
There is a distinction, I think, is important to make. I think Maritain, to some extent, he does, between what we call state and what we call government. And the distinction, I'm going to start with the distinction between the nation state entail that the state itself is made of three factors. One is territory, another is the population, and the third is power. Now, how then we exercise power, that is what we call government. And that government would be democratic, aristocratic, you name it. So when we exercise power, we call government, the government of the state. Now, the question is, what is the force, the nutrient, if you will, that moves those who are in government? There you have the culture of that particular nation where the government is established. Now, what is the direction of that nation? And I think Maritain implied there is a common purpose, final cause, if you will, a common purpose. And what is that common purpose? Well, sometimes it's very fluid. Let me give you an example. From the early 1800s up to early 1960s in Latin America, there was what we call a schizophrenia, which meant basically that the nation was made of tradition where the glue was the Catholic Church. There you have just one nation. But then you have many governments which were managing states. And these states were obeying somehow the ideology that were coming from the French Revolution. So you have there a schizophrenia. Government directed by an ideology which was completely contrary to the nation. And so you have a schizophrenia. The elite is the one who was guiding the people, has no business because the difference was so great between the nation and the government, or the nation and the state.
Right, and that's it's very similar to what John Paul II, people say about John Paul II, where you had the Polish nation, and then you had the state, right? You had the government in Poland, et cetera, which was completely dominated by communists, et cetera.
Right, exactly. One final point, when John Paul II visited for his first trip, he went to Mexico. And he proposed precisely what he called evangelization of the culture. By culture, really, he meant the nation. When you read the document in Puebla, the meaning was the nation, the habits, the ethos, and the glue that brought that culture together for him was the Catholic faith. It was unequivocal. Because that was giving the whole nation the common purpose.
Right. And, I mean, part of the issue is, again, the degree to which the state or the government takes itself for the whole and has interests or purposes which are contrary to those, right, of that the ones that really represent the nation. Right? So you sort of say, we have, in the case of, well, both Latin America and Poland, right, we have state people who are like, look, we need to replace this thing which is part and parcel of the faith of the nation and the culture of the nation, namely the Catholic faith and Catholic principles, with communist principles. And so then you've got this thing where the government constantly is working at cross purposes with the living tradition of the nation, as it were.
A number of things come to mind here. I'm certainly appreciating all the distinctions and examples. When I think of the role of the church, one of the things that comes to mind is Peter Morin, co-founder of the Catholic Worker, was very fond of saying cult, culture, cultivation. And I think that really probably comes from Christopher Dawson. It's the notion of we first of all start with a cultus, the religion, and that gives rise to a culture. And, well, the cultivation is really the tricky thing today. I know people who've moved from California to Ohio to pursue cultivation. Some sense, what we could say is some sense of the land. And more, I think people have no sense of the land. Think of Gone with the Wind. It ends with, it's the land, it's the land. Well, if you've moved 7 times in your career, you don't have a vocation, you have a career, so you've moved 7 times. The notion of land or the localism is completely lost. So that notion of culture, and cultivation, I think, is an interesting and easy way into our discussion. Another point, I think both Mario and Randy mentioned this, the term regime, which I oftentimes associate with Straussians, but very often we'll say the current regime in such and such a country, and then we always are hearing about regime change. Oh, we love the people of such and such, but it's time for a regime change. So when it gets all complicated and all muddled, we're sometimes looking for extremely adept, not politicians, but statesmen who can somehow keep all of these factors in play, which leads me...
Let me say something.
Yes.
Yeah, James, those are 2 really good points. Let me say something about each one of them, if I may, because I think they're really important. The culture. I think, and I've written about this, that John Paul II, when he talked about the new evangelization, he meant, as Mario said, he meant the evangelization of culture. Because he was very much keyed into something, I think, developments that had happened since Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum, but not just Rerum Novarum, but the whole structure of the church since that time, which is that, and Russ Hittinger's sort of introduction to a volume on law, politics, and society is really good on this, it seems to me, which is that Leo XIII understood, and popes after him sort of understood, that what we needed to do was we couldn't reestablish sort of medieval institutions, and we couldn't work through monarchies anymore because they were being replaced by democracies, and we didn't and also there were just ways in which that set of church-state relations wasn't working, but that the idea was that increasingly the Catholic Church would have to operate as a kind of leaven within society, right? Operating, as it were, from below. And so you would, as it were, enleaven, right? Particularly, and this is one of the tragedies I'm going to get to, is enleaven in the society, because at the time of Leo XIII, you had this amazing Catholic educational network throughout the world, one of the most amazing educational networks anywhere, right? With universities and secondary schools and primary schools. And I think he thought, see, we can leverage this, we can use this, as it were, to go out and evangelize the world, but we don't evangelize them necessarily by trying to control governments directly, right? Having bishops somehow, make deals with, the mayor of New York or something, which isn't a horrible thing, but it's just not the way it should operate mostly. Now, of course, what's happened to that is two things, and the first, I think, is the most tragic, is that whole tremendous patrimony of educational, Catholic educational network has been completely lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't done anything like what it was supposed to do. And so now people are sort of, again, back to sort of like, why isn't the bishop making a deal with, the president of the United States? Like, yeah, we're not operating that way, right? What we're supposed to do is go to Catholic schools and learn things and then go out into the world, right? And this was John Paul II on the laity. And you go have a business and you employ people and you treat them with fundamental Catholic principles, right? You start a Catholic school or a Catholic university and you treat your workers with, a kind of Catholic charity, which of course is not anything that's happening in any Catholic institution, right? They talk about social justice, but they don't treat their own people with social justice. And so you have that. The other thing, of course, is you can't forget about the regime because, in the contemporary American culture, part of the issue is, we've frittered away our patrimony. And our question now is whether we're going to be allowed to exist, right? I mean, in other words, whether these Catholic schools are going to be allowed to continue to teach Catholic principles or, Catholic organizations are going to be allowed to continue to do adoptions or Catholic hospitals not do abortions, et cetera, et cetera. So that, issue, we're back to this issue of the government trying to, impose certain principles or an ideology, we might say, on the nation in ways in which, unfortunately, the Catholic Church hasn't done its job in the United States of forming the nation culturally. When John Paul II insisted that was its primary thing it needed to do, right? And of course, I think we've failed miserably at that.
Christopher, anything to add? Things are getting really serious here.
Well, I guess one thing I just want to, maybe it's a clarification, I don't know, but at least be a clarification for me. When we talk about, Mario brought up the Catholic faith as being like the soul of the nation, and I think that's true. I think because what it formed for Latin America, indeed for much of Catholic Europe, was it gave the highest goals of the common good. So it formed the nation in that way. But if it can't be merely, obviously, I don't think this was being said, but it can't be merely the Catholic Church which forms the culture, because there are many different nations that have the Catholic faith, or it did have the Catholic faith. So there have to be other things that go into it. It seems like what we're maybe talking about so far is a kind of, when we talk about nation, we're talking maybe like an analogous category. Is that correct? In some cases, it's almost like the nation is almost something more like soil and blood, to use an old fascist term. Oh. In other cases, it's a kind of shared set of societal goals. Though the latter one I find a little difficult, because I can imagine you could have two separate nations that have very similar societal goals or the same societal goals, and that wouldn't distinguish the nation either. So when we get down to it, isn't there something even when we're talking about a kind of a commonality of culture, and whatever that it means exactly? I guess the kind of music we listen to, the kind of language we speak, the habits we have in daily intercourse, and that type of thing. I wonder if is that basically what's being said here?
I would say, those things could and often do help form a culture. They're not unimportant. I think one of the things that challenges us in the United States is we've never had the nation be quite that way, right? Or be formed in quite that way. We've always had this, what people call a melting pot, we may call it a mélange of very, very different cultural traditions. And that's been our strength and our, in some ways weakness. I mean, it's our challenge, just put it that way. But, so that's why I've always argued that, and I did today, right, that what has united, two things you might say have united the United States as a nation to the extent that it's been a nation. And one, of course, has been its Protestant past, although the Catholics have a very, very important role to play in that. But we might say the thing that unites the two of those is a scriptural, biblical tradition and background, right, as being important. Now, whether it continues to be important, that, of course, has a lot to do with why the nation may be falling apart. But that, and again, I would argue it's Republican, I don't mean Republican Party, although I love the Republican Party, it's fine. The point is the Republican tradition, right, constitutional tradition. People came to the country and said, aha, I could be part of this country where there is not, right, a tyranny, okay? And what preserved that, and of course, people came into the country, you can tell it, people came into the country and they didn't have to learn French, they didn't have to learn French history. What they had to learn was they had to know some things about the Constitution of the United States of America. And the fact that people in the country don't any longer have any devotion to the Constitution, the constitutional order. It's not just the document, obviously, but the constitutional order. That even the people in the government have no respect for the constitutional order is why the thing is falling apart, right? It's always been the case that we've had many languages and many kinds of music and food and et cetera, and that's fine. What had united us was that we had lots of people who were devoted to a kind of biblical morality in various and sundry ways and a kind of biblical ethos, and our devotion to a particular governmental form which is determined by a constitution.
Okay, may I ask a further question on that? It seems like what you're talking about, though, could be something analogous to what Roman law did for the Roman Empire and certain Roman institutions did for the Roman Empire. Was the Roman Empire a nation?
It seems to me that what you're talking about, right, is that in the early days during the Republic, and as you know, I mean, people like Cicero and others write about this, the loss of the nation and its devolution into an empire, okay? And so then you no longer have, right, a Roman people who have a shared common tradition as it became an empire, right? Now you have people who are merely vying for power and privilege and esteem and wealth in the empire. So when they were united around an ideal of freedom and when they were united around an ideal of law, right, then they were a nation. What they became was an empire. That's what I'm saying about that question.
I guess I'm thinking about the I guess I'm thinking about the empire around, let's say, the time of Trajan, during the time of the good emperors, where you did have a common tradition of law which united the entire empire. And it was, more or less done pretty well. It was before the final devolution. It began with Caracalla. But, my question would be is that the kind of institutions we're talking about, the kind of things like that unite all these disparate cultures in the Roman Empire, seems something very similar to what we're talking about that unites the United States as a nation. But I don't think we generally call the Roman Empire a nation, but we would call the United States.
Again, these are modern terms. That's true, right? But again, look, to the extent, and plenty of people before Trajan, are talking about this, which is to say, what had been and there are pros and cons to this, as Augustine says, but, what had been a common devotion to an ideal, and an important ideal, in the development of Rome and its freedom from others and its sort of political order, had devolved into a concern for wealth, power, and prestige. And to the extent that, and of course that signaled the eventual breakup of the Roman Empire. I mean, look, but they maintained military predominance for a good long while. But I think as the United States devolves into simply people being devoted to the United States, to whatever government happens to be there, as long as it serves their needs or their desires for wealth, power, and prestige, that signals the end of the nation. Now, governments will come and go based upon, you're going to make us wealthy, you're going to give us power, you're going to, I get that. And it may be successful for a while. I mean, the Roman Empire went on for a while, right? But that has to do with their being able to leverage certain military things in certain ways. But we might say, yeah, but I just, I think that they were doomed.
Yeah, I guess.
Wow. There's a commentator of some note, token serious Christian in the New York Times, who says that currently our situation is rotten but stable. We've been talking about devolution. We've been talking about the loss of constitutional orientation. We've been talking about the fragmentation and secularization of what once had people that once had a biblical grounding. Well, with all of those factors in play, should we say that now in the United States we're dealing with something that's rotten but stable, or is there a better description?
Well, how about rotten and unstable?
Yeah, I'm especially thinking of that when it comes to shared history. In California, and soon to be in many other states, we have a minority-majority, and if you talk about the traditions of old New England, means next to nothing. So that whole notion of a shared history is really debated and oftentimes denied. And just for an inflammatory example of the cross purposes and misunderstanding cross purposes of things, we have AOC, the famed progressive congresswoman, saying that there should be a statue of Saint Damien, of Damien and the lepers, is caving in. This is an official place in Hawaii, a caving in to the legacy of colonialism. Completely different accounts of or estimations of historical trajectories.
May I say something?
Please do, Mario.
So I think, again, the distinction between government and the nation. If the nation is made of a glue, and that glue is the common culture, common value, biblical tradition, you name it, when we start losing that, of course, the model of the constitution of the government will be very difficult to maintain, to keep it. Because to some extent, that model, if you will, fit into a nation was once upon a time have this common trait, this common purpose. So if you say, well, then a legislator is trying to eliminate a statue is because she or he doesn't have any memory of what the culture is all about. So if that is the case, perhaps the responsibility is not that those who exercise power in the government is from those who should be evangelizing and creating that culture, that educational base for that particular country. Just one thing, when the Christian Democrats in Latin America tried to establish their novelty, if you will, in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, was because they want to reconcile two things. One, the culture, which was quintessentially then Catholic, is no longer Catholic today, but was quintessential Catholic. But at the same time, they said, well, we need a structure which in itself preserve the truth of that culture, but with freedom. And so they start playing with the two, if you will, principles, freedom and truth. And so they created certain systems which was completely different from previous Catholic system, which was truth without freedom, was more authoritarian, and the military junta was favor the Catholic Church and all that. So that model presupposes, of course, an educational system that then was working. And that began getting, being eliminated or put aside by some ideologies and so on in the 1960s. So, and I think is my point. If we expect the government to create that culture that we expect be the proper culture to fit into the system, I think I don't think we are going to win much.
No, we need the government not to, in fact, to respect the culture rather than try to control the culture in various and sundry ways. It seems to me. But look, people like, certainly all sorts of people in different directions, right, who don't respect history. In fact, here's would be the point about that. It's not only that we don't respect the history and the dynamic of the history, okay, that it's complex. It's not just a story of good guys versus bad guys, but it's a complex sort of situation. But then you have people who sort of want to change history. People who control history, of course, this is true of the Soviet Union, right? People control history. They do that because they want to control the ideology. And we've got people now who are sort of embarrassed, right, by history. But let me bring it back to Catholic education, if I may, right, on our own. Well, look, since, what makes this possible that we have this ridiculous sort of thing where statues are taken down, like Columbus is taken down. Ulysses S. Grant statue is, Grant, whatever racist. What are you talking about? And the point is, this has come about because who teaches history anymore, right? The educational system has left us open, including the Catholic educational system has left us open to this, right? Because, of course, the point is, if you go into Catholic educational institutions, you say, well, look, everybody needs to understand the founding documents, the history of America in certain ways, the dynamic Civil War, whatever it is. And the point is, no. Don't ask people to take those courses. No. They just need STEM courses, and there's nothing wrong with STEM. But the point is, because what? We need them to be able to go out and get good jobs. You sold the soul of Catholic education, right, for money. So, you have some Catholic universities with billions of dollars, and the point is, are they forming good citizens who understand the nature of the country, who understand the nature of the constitutional order, who understand the fundamental principles of the Catholic faith and the difficulty of reconciling all those things, right? And the answer is no. All they know is, here's the techne that I know to go out and be, a computer programmer or a systems analyst or a, urologist or something. Again, all very, very noble things, but are they doing them as good citizens and as good Catholics? And that's not there. And so, again, when people don't know history and somebody goes, oh, Damien, he was a racist, or Flannery O'Connor, she was a racist or something, everybody goes, oh, I guess so. Because, of course, who's read Flannery O'Connor except some people? Who's done the history except some people, right? And so you're left largely, unfortunately, Catholic education as well, left with these people who are subject to being absolutely led around by the nose. They're not free men. They don't have a liberal education. Because a liberal education is some idealistic thing, and largely we just need them to go to confession and then go out and make money so they can give us, billions of dollars in endowment money or something. That's pretty much what you get. And people are embarrassed about the Catholic faith, the biblical background, et cetera, et cetera. And I have very little patience for people who are embarrassed by the traditions of this nation or the traditions of the Catholic Church.
All right, now let's make everything even more complex. We are experiencing waves of immigration, both in Europe and in the United States. How should we factor that in to the concepts that we've been working with in our conversation?
Well, look, if you're asking me, right?
Go ahead. Everybody else will contest what you say, but we might as well begin with what you say.
Right. Look, and I've written about this, right, which is to say that if you've got a living tradition, it seems to me, right, and you've got a strong nation, and a nation which hasn't defined itself. See, I don't know how they're going to deal with this exactly in Europe in quite the same way, right? Because you have nation states that have developed around historically and still by a certain kind of linguistic identity and cultural identity of a certain sort, right? It's very important to be French and to speak French and to speak French in a certain way, or to speak Hochdeutsch versus other Deutsch. You know, it's that those are essential parts of their tradition and of their identity. That has just never been the case in the United States, right? So I would and have argued that immigration need not be a threat, okay, to the nation, okay, depending upon the kinds of people that you're getting. And by that I don't mean like low class, high class, are they this or that, the other thing. I mean, are they people who are devoted to and are willing to be devoted and have come to be devoted to the common good of the nation, right? So that's the distinction which has to be made, it seems to me, right? If you're talking about people who are coming here and wish only to get rich, and or people who are coming here and have no respect for the American constitutional order, well, now you have a problem, right?
Yes,
Previous
all right.
waves of immigration involved those who had a very deep sense of a communal sense, and many of them had a very deep sense of, you know, sort of biblical morality and a biblical ethos, whether the Jews or Christians, and, you know, have made good in the United States and made the United States what it is. On the other hand, if I mention this as well, if a state was using immigration, maybe not even intentionally, but immigration was favored precisely because it was going to undermine the character of the nation, well, now you've got a big problem, right? Because now you might say, look, we've got a huge pile of immigrants coming from, it generally tends to be the Middle East, right? In the United States, it tends to be Latin America, whatever. But again, oftentimes people are worried about immigration from the Middle East. And it's kind of like, look, do these people have a certain set of values and devotion to America, right, to the United States, which is going to make them good citizens of the United States? And, of course, the answer is that's not so clear. But then again, are all the people working at Google, you know, really devoted to the common good of the United States? And the answer is, well, that's dubious, right? Many of the people coming to the United States are more devoted to the United States nation and culture than the people who actually were born here. And so that tends to be a problem, right? But look, there's many aspects of this, and we're just talking about the cultural aspects right at the moment. So some people would obviously call in and say, but what about this, and what about that on the border, and what about drugs, and what it's like, yeah, look, it's a very complicated issue. Right now we were just talking about it, I'm just talking about it as a potential threat to the nation, okay? And it doesn't have to be a potential threat to the nation. It could be a threat to the state if the state thinks that the immigrants are going to threaten their power. Yes, that's true too, right? But that's why you want to make the distinction between the nation and the state.
Mario, you
Yes.
have, I'm sure, special insights in this area.
Right. Yes. You mentioned a few times the word common good. Common good. which in the tradition of Jacques Maritain has a very unique place. So much so that he was challenged by some thinkers. In Latin America, he was accused of being heretic because his view on the common good. Now, in the American context, some people are debating about the common good. And it seems that debate is necessary, but I think it's more necessary educate people, at least Catholics, what really the common good means. And my experience has been quite negative during this pandemic because people not even know how to use this principle in order to wear or not to wear masks. It seems that the common good is completely unknown. My question is, how would you address that issue? How do we go and educate people about fair or reasonable notion of what the common good is?
Well, the first thing I wouldn't do, of course, is get them engaged in the debate between Maritain and the supposed debate between Maritain and de Hanink on this. It's a high-level debate. It's not unimportant, meaning I think it's important, right? That's the academic way of saying important, right? It's not unimportant. But by the same token, you're right, Mario, that I have found when I teach a course in Catholic social justice that when I get to the issue of the common good, do I get people who really understand the notion of the common good, and they don't, right? And so what they generally mean, right, and this is something we have to, is they think, well, the common good means a kind of aggregate good, right? Like, so I have some good and you have some good and somebody else has some good and somebody, and then we sort of add it all up and that's the common good. And of course, the common good in the United States is like, well, I got to do what I wanted to do and you got to do what you wanted to do and the people over there got what they wanted to do. And of course, that's not, so first thing we have to do is puncture that notion of the common good. Not because we don't want people to have good things, but because in fact, that's not exactly. So I start with images like, look, if somebody has a pizza, okay, if somebody, people start taking pieces of the pizza, you just have less pizza. There's no way of getting around it. All right. But if I go to a movie and I enjoy it a certain amount and I say, oh, do you want to come see the movie with me? I'm willing to see it again. And then they come and watch it with you. It's not like when there's two people there watching the movie, I get half as much joy out of the movie than I did before. There's a common good. I'm sharing something with someone else, and precisely in the sharing, and of course I might share the pizza, that's true too, but the point is when I'm sharing the thing with somebody else, then we call that a common good. And those are the kinds of things that we're particularly talking about, and I think then Maritain has a more developed notion of that. And again, I don't want to get into the Maritain de Hanink debate right at the moment, not that it's not important in various sundry ways, but I just think the first thing we have to talk about is those things which are shared, and a culture of individualism such as we have, of hyper-individualism and individual autonomy such as we have in the United States right now, is simply blinds us in many ways to the common good. And something like a pandemic depends upon people understanding, and plenty of people have understood, look, I have to do certain things myself in my own life in order to protect other people, right? And they've made plenty of sacrifices, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, there's the whole political theater. Lots of people all around are making all sorts of personal sacrifices, not because they think they'll get sick, but because they don't want other people to get sick, people they don't even know. And that has something to do with that. We might say that's the common good. That's a devotion to the common good. There are other people, of course, that just don't care, and they just do whatever they want. They go to parties, and they do stuff, and they've, protest, et cetera, just because they want to do it, and then they're super spreaders, and that's like, yeah, but I just want to do what I want to do. It's like, well, okay, but that's not the American notion of the common good, is that I get to do whatever I want to do.
Christopher, join in again, please.
Well, yeah, I guess I don't want to get into this intense debate about the whatever differences there may be between de Hanink and Maritain, though. I must say, my notion of the common good has been formed more by Draconic, but I think that when we talk about the common good, we still have to define it more or less, and we have to define it by the highest principles of that inspire society to do what it does, and that would seem to be ultimately a kind of religion. It could be the Catholic religion, it could be something which stands in the place of religion, like a philosophy. To what extent when we talk about, like if one is a Catholic, one I would think have a sense of what the highest good that should direct human life is, that would be different than, say, even the Americans of the generation after the Revolution. To what extent, if a nation is formed by this notion of the common good, would Catholics stand as part of that nation if they disagree on some fundamental understanding of the common good?
Well, here's where I think John Paul II was quite, as with so many things, genius, because he constantly used the language of, while not avoiding other important language, but he constantly talked about the dignity of the human person, right? The dignity of the human person, and trying to remind people in the West or trying to point out to them, he's trying to remind them of the dignity of the human person and point out to them the ways in which they had lost that sense of the true dignity of the human person. But of course, then he always sort of said, the dignity of the human person included its openness to the transcendent, to religious, to God, to higher things, right? But it seems to me that, again, when we get lost in the atheism debates or something, I'd be like, oh, God, it's just like, well, okay. Even if we disagreed on that, could you affirm with us the inviolable dignity of the human person, right? And so I talk to my students about, like, when you go to the doctor, you don't want to be treated like a flesh machine. You want to be treated as a person. And then, like, what does that mean? Okay? Now, that's only the first step. Look, I get that does not going to get us to the common good yet, but the point is we're going to say the dignity of the human person is precisely discovered in its selfless gift of itself to others, right? And so when we recover that dignity, okay, and recover at least a deep openness to the transcendent, right? I mean, and by that, I mean even to the degree that you're Plato or Aristotle or something, like where you're thinking seriously about higher principles, okay, and fundamental moral principles that somehow guide humanity, then that's the way we may just have to go. Now, of course, this is why abortion becomes such a fundamental problem in American society. Because, of course, if you can't recognize, and same thing with euthanasia, and same thing with, the abortion of every, sort of Down syndrome fetus in the land, unborn child in the land, is that there simply isn't a respect for the dignity of the human person, right? You can't have a society that's based on offing huge portions of the population and then talk about the respect for the dignity of the human person.
As always happens, we're getting close to the end, and when that is the case, I like to muddy the waters a little bit more, knowing that I might entice our guests to return. And I think knowing Professor Smith, I won't have to entice him very much. But a couple of things to note. Under the category of everything is up for grabs, certainly the concept of the common good is fiercely debated. And when you shift to dignity, the notion of dignity as a kind of giving us a sense of moral direction, that's up for grabs. It's been 2 or 3 years now, which seems a long time the way public debate goes, but 2 or 3 years ago, or maybe even 3 or 4 years ago, major firefight among intellectuals launched by a fellow named Steven Pinker, who gets all kinds of coverage, and his essay at this point was named The Stupidity of Dignity. And he argued that only United Nations documents and the Catholic Church thought dignity was a workable concept, and in fact what we ought to do is focus on autonomy. So, is there a fight going on there? You bet there's a fight going on there. Well, I guess we come now perilously close to, in our conversation, and maybe it's an expression of our frustration, perilously close to saying that maybe we're dealing with a failed state. Now, if we are dealing with a failed state, certainly whether we succeed in the short term or not, we want to have what should I say, going to the roots of things, responses. And I will just ask our guest one last question. What would you think, Professor Smith, about a group of people informed in large part by Catholic social principles who wanted to start and make stick a new political party? And they might even give it as a title. In fact, they did, something that comes from John Paul II, the American Solidarity Party. And suppose they insisted that we're going to be neither left nor right. We're going to look to the person and look to community. And suppose these people had a lot of good ideas, but they didn't have any money and they didn't have any particularly political smarts background. What would you say to such a group of people?
God bless you. What do we have in the Epistle of James? We say to the poor man, have a nice day. No, tell us more. Tell us more about how God will bless us and how you will help God bless us. I know, look, I suppose that's a very unsatisfying answer. And I'll once, when I was in a class with Alistair McIntyre, he said, he got a letter from a group that said, we want to live life, like in our little town, according to sort of principles from after virtue, like we're going to try to live this way. To which I guess Alistair McIntyre wrote them back and said, this is wonderful that you're going to try to do this. Now, I just will tell you in advance, you will fail. But you will fail in ways that are interesting to people like me, right? So, I don't know, I suppose I could say to such people, God bless you, you will fail, but the only question is whether you will fail in ways that are actually interesting in, and instructive in various sincerity. But look, I really have no knowledge of that party or what's going on. I guess I know.
The international World Wide Web, and I know that the next time we talk to you, and I know that next time will be fairly soon, that you will have specific knowledge.
I will have done my due diligence and studied the party and know all sorts about. Look, I just would say this. Look, I don't think we're going to make any headway until we start having the kinds of serious discussion. Look, it's muddied. That's true. Dignity. Pinker's not completely wrong. But the whole idea would be, I think John Rawls is exactly wrong. And those who don't know the John Rawls issue, the point is, you can't have these discussions about deep fundamental issues. I think, in fact, we're not going to make any headway until we start having these discussions about deep fundamental issues. So I would have said to the Pinker thing, look, precisely the issue about the nature of the human person and what makes the human person dignified, right, this claim about their dignity, is the discussion we need to be having rather than just talking about, right, various and sundry technical ways of manipulating either the market or this, that, or the other thing, etc. Again, none of which is evil. But again, if you're a John Paul II devotee in certain ways, then you don't just want to preach, you want to teach. And that's something that has to happen, it seems to me, in the schools. Okay, so I would have said any money that the political party is going to get, right, just to poke you just a little bit, any political money that the political party wants to get should all go to Catholic secondary schools and elementary schools, which are producing students who will be a leaven for society, right, who will be the future of whatever that party might be, which I don't know, but of course I'll have to look at the website and I'll have to find out. But the point is, but here's the point. Stop spending sending millions and millions of dollars to educational institutions that are not doing the job and are, failing to be what John Paul II wanted these institutions to be, and start looking and finding those places that are actually doing what needs to be done, or the people within institutions that are doing what needs to be done, the way Ralph McInerney was at Notre Dame, et cetera, et cetera. And he had money, people gave to him. The Center for Ethics and Culture at Notre Dame, similarly, right? You look for these places and you try to help them, and you try to help them, right, form the next generation.
All right,
help parents form the next generation. As for political parties,
we have a direction that you've given us, and I think it's a good direction. And you have some homework, and all our auditors, those gentle auditors, although most of them probably know about the American Solidarity Party, they have some homework. And we have, even when things seem to be falling apart, we have the gospel. And I want to end with the gospel for today. And it's from Matthew. At that time, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman of that district came and called out, "Have pity on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not say a word in answer to her. His disciples came and asked him, "Send her away, for she keeps calling out after us." He said in reply, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But the woman came and did him homage, saying, "Lord, help me." He said in reply, "It is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Please, Lord, for even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table of their masters." Then Jesus said to her in reply, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed from that hour. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you so much. We'll be back next week.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.